Okay, right.
Let's go.
Today we welcome all participants to our public theology series put on by Belfast South Methodist Church. This is the third in our series of Thinking Aloud, and today on the 16th of March, we think about St. Patrick and the Shared Island. We welcome our guest presenter, Reverend Dr. Johnston McMaster, an Associate Professor of the Irish School of Ecumenics. Thank you, Johnston, for leading our discussion. Over to you now.
Thank you, Ian. St. Patrick came as a 16-year-old slave to Ireland, captured and taken from his family in the family estate in the northwest of Roman Britain. The trauma experienced by a teenager snatched out of his world of family and culture, as experienced by every slave, is unimaginable. He made his escape eventually from Ireland and travelled back home. Some years pass when Patrick, in France or Britain, undertakes theological and religious formation for a life in the church. It is remarkable when he has some sense of calling to return to the island of his enslavement, and he voluntarily travels to Ireland as a person on a mission to the Irish. At the hands of the Irish, he has suffered the violence of slavery, yet returns to do nothing but good with them and for them. Some will see an act of forgiveness there, which not everyone would find possible or easy. The traditional date for his return to Ireland is 432 CE, which has no historical basis. That's something of a made-up date, as is 450 CE, which may, though, be more likely. We don't know. We know very little about Patrick, which is probably why he has been reinvented hundreds of times in Ireland and wherever the Irish diaspora are found. Looking for the historical Patrick is a difficult, maybe impossible task. But we do have two historical documents that are not strictly biographical, but provide us with insights into some aspects of his character. In terms of history, we have one piece of historical information, all the more precious because it is only one reliable, authentic line. Prosper of Aquitaine in his chronicles has a line with reference to 431 CE. To the Irish believing in Christ, ordained by Pope Celestine, Palladius is sent as their first bishop. Prosper was not only a contemporary, but was involved in this piece of activity that brought a Bishop Palladius to the Irish who believe. Now, this was before Patrick ever arrives in Ireland, and it deconstructs one of our big pieces of fiction that Patrick brought Christianity to Ireland. What Prosper is saying and implying is that in 431 there already were enough Irish Christians to require a bishop, and that there was also a community sufficiently organised to request a bishop and to communicate their request to Rome. Furthermore, these Irish who already believe are the native Gaels. We can't go much further than that without creating more fiction from Prosper's words, but that entry in his chronicles is precious history. Christianity was in Ireland before Patrick. Patrick was not Irish, but Romano-British. He was born into Roman Britain, and the British bit does not mean British as it means today, if we know what British means today. At the Union of Crowns in 1603, King James VI of Scotland became James I of England and invented the word British to describe the people of his new expanded kingdom. He also invented the divine right of kings, which conveniently put him above question and demanded obedience as of God. Now that's power for you. Patrick belongs to a more ancient world dominated by Roman imperialism, the mighty Roman Empire which invaded Britain in 55 BCE and was still there over 500 years later when Patrick came to Ireland. It wasn't going to be there for much longer because the empire was about to go the way of every empire in history. Rome was about to crash out of history and become historical wreckage with all the post-imperial destruction and legacy the fall of empire brings. The Romans never got to Ireland. It was close, as they did have a small army ready to cross from somewhere near Cairnryan when there was a nasty Scots revolt, the Scots looking for independence, no doubt, which diverted the Roman forces and spared Ireland the Roman presence and dominance. The Romans centralized everything, creating administrative structures highly organized and so effective that the church in Britain, as elsewhere, shaped its dioceses around the administrative boundaries, and ecclesial governance imitated political governance. Ireland, without the Romans, remained decentralized, with up to 150 sub-kingdoms or tuata, and the church structure was monastic, with the abbots and abbesses holding the power and not bishops. Ireland was decentralized in every way, and it was into this Ireland that Christianity took root. And Patrick eventually came, perhaps in 350 CE. Now, however effective he was as a person on a mission, he never succeeded in imposing a diocesan structure on the early Irish church. And that never happened until 1101. The Irish church would be a community, monastic-based church for some 700 years. We turn to Patrick's letters. There are lives of Patrick written in Armagh at different times, and some 2 or 3 centuries after Patrick returned to Ireland. It is impossible to tell legend from fact in these lives. They're certainly not biography, but are lives written for political purposes. In the 7th and 8th centuries, there was a battle going on in the Irish church for primacy. Where would the ecclesial centre of power be? The contest for primacy was between Armagh and Kildare. And lives of Patrick were written in Armagh, associating the saint with Armagh and putting forward the case for Armagh to hold the primacy of the Irish church. 2 things worth noting. Spirituality and religion are not averse to playing politics and power games. There are and may be ecclesial leaders who rather enjoy it. This was the era of Christendom, and for the last almost 4 centuries, the church in Europe was already in bed with the empire and inseparable from political power. The other thing is that the lives of Patrick are invented fiction and fake news, which predates Trumpism by centuries. Telling lies about Brexit is nothing new. They were pretty good at spin in Armagh 1400 years ago. And Armagh still holds the primacy for Irish Catholics and the Church of Ireland. We do have 2 authentic documents believed to be from Patrick. There is historical consensus on this. And those 2 authentic documents are Patrick's confession and the letter to the soldiers of Coroticus. They are 2 of the most remarkable documents surviving from ancient times. It is not possible to date them except to say that they belong to the latter years of Patrick's life. He has been in Ireland for some time when he was forced to write these 2 documents. The 2 short documents from Patrick open up windows in the world of then and into what really mattered for a remarkable person struggling with social injustices and ambiguities within his own character and personality. He emphasizes in his confession his weakness and sinfulness so much that you want him to stop beating himself up and get over his inferiority complex. But in the confession, his life and work are under serious attack when critics who do not think he's up for the job, not fit for purpose. Others think he's not sufficiently well educated. He's having to pay protection money to do his work, and others accuse him of misappropriating money or not disclosing the sources of his income. His orthodoxy is called into question. Is he truly Christian at all? There are threats of kidnapping and violence against him. And then somebody, a close childhood friend, makes public some dark secret from years past, something Patrick did which he thought was long past, but has now gone viral. In the world of then, it was probably one of three terrible sins: sexual immorality, and we've all just thought that, idolatry, and murder. A real possibility is that in his youth, Patrick, in some moment of anger, did take another's life. Whatever, now 4th century Facebook has dragged it up again, and the social media of the day has put him in the dock once more. An attempt to discredit and assassinate his character. All of this forces Patrick to write the confession and defend himself, his character, and his life's work. The second document is from a very angry Patrick to the soldiers of Caroticus, a Pictish chieftain who has raided Ireland and has taken probably hundreds of people into slavery, killing many in the raiding process, and abusing in violent ways the rights and the lives of human beings. We come back to the letter in a moment. Neither of these documents is strictly history or biography, but they are fascinating insights into Patrick's life struggles and Ireland during a very turbulent time. Been described in this way. The two letters are in fact the earliest surviving documents written in Ireland and provide us with glimpses of a world full of petty kings, pagan gods, quarrelling bishops, brutal slavery, beautiful virgins, and ever-threatening violence. But more than anything else, they allow us to look inside the mind and soul of a remarkable man living in a world that was falling apart and at the dawn of a new age. It is a world falling apart and the dawn of a new age that might have resonance for us in Ireland, and in a world that may undergo profound change in the next decade or two. In Patrick's letters, we may be reading letters of hope in a trying and uncertain time. Let's look at a cry for justice. This is the heart of the angry letter to the soldiers of Caroticus. Patrick doesn't mince his words in a letter which is not a private letter, but is to be read and is read in public. The letter protesting evil calls Caroticus and his soldiers father killer and brother killer, raging wolves. In what is now, I think, offensive language in itself, Patrick uses the image of a prostitute as a she-wolf devouring parts of Christ's body or handing over members of Christ to a whorehouse. Patrick identifies greed as the root cause of evil. Greed drove the slave trade of Caroticus, as it drove the European Christian slave trade of our modern era, and built the cities of Bristol and London and Liverpool and Manchester and Glasgow. It was greed that drove the slave trade that produced the Industrial Revolution, that built the empires with their economies of extraction, that constructed a racist world of white supremacy and leaves us today complicit in our racially constructed world and struggling with the terrible legacies of colonialism and a world of inequalities. Patrick wrote, "They live by plunder." That was Caroticus and every European empire and America and China. The letter to the soldiers of Caroticus is a speaking of truth to power. It is a protest against socio-economic evil, a cry for justice and liberation. The letter ends with a clarion call for liberation of all the enslaved, and what may surprise us in reading the end of the letter, it's a cry for the liberation of women. Mary de Poor has said, Patrick, the Apostle of Ireland, and a person for all seasons, is the first person to call for the abolition of slavery and for the liberation of women. That call will not be made again until the 17th century. In a world of racial and gender inequality, it is still a call that needs to be heard, and strangely perhaps in the COVID-19 pandemic, is being heard again. Finally, a shared scent for a shared island. Even today, in a more secular island where there is a separation of church and state, making it a very different island from the one Patrick returned to, it is difficult not to believe that Patrick is shared by all. There is certainly a shared awareness of St. Patrick's Day and its significance for people in Ireland and around the world, as ironically a diaspora living mainly in the former colonies of the British Empire. What we have maybe is a secular saint being celebrated in largely secular ways. And in a strange way, Patrick is a lead figure in secular ecumenism. Across the former colonies of the British Empire, St. Patrick is a bigger draw with a higher profile than St. George, St. David, or St. Andrew. They don't close off a main thoroughfare for a whole day in Auckland, New Zealand, for George or David or Andrew, but they do for Patrick. My daughter Claire enjoyed it for all of the 10 years she lived in Auckland. From Derry to Cork, even Londonderry to Cork, and from Belfast to Dublin, we share St. Patrick. But we don't share the island, not even in a pandemic. A century ago, Ireland was partitioned in a way which was not the only option at the time. The partition was never meant to last, according to the Government of Ireland Act, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and according to the speech made by King George V at the opening of the Northern Ireland Parliament in June 1921. For an arrangement only intended to be temporary, it has lasted for a century, but has never been secure, and probably never will be. In October last, An Taoiseach announced a Shared Island initiative. Significantly, the initiative was announced in St. Patrick's Hall in Dublin Castle, not only the St. Patrick connection, but in Dublin Castle, the centre of British power and governance in the Ireland of a more colonial time. The symbolism was quite powerful, and the shared island idea was taking seriously the Belfast Agreement and its goals of reconciliation and tolerance and trust. The three strands of relationships at the heart of the agreement were also being highlighted. In launching the initiative, the Taoiseach made significant things crystal clear, and in doing so, decoupled the Shared Island Initiative from constitutional issues. The agreement was reiterated that the constitutional future of the island is founded on the principle of consent. The right of everyone was affirmed to make the case for the constitutional future they wish to see, whether they are nationalist, unionist, or neither. The genius, he said, of the agreement is that we do not need to be defined or dominated by constitutional questions as we were in the past. That is clear, though a few didn't hear and decided to interpret the Taoiseach's initiative as some kind of backdoor to a united Ireland. A weakness, though, of the Belfast Agreement is that it still locks us into binary approach to Northern Ireland and its future or otherwise. We are to be either nationalists or unionists. But in the 23 years since, growing numbers of people are neither, and growing numbers of young people are no longer interested in being Protestant or Catholic, unionist or nationalist. What many young people are concerned with are environmental concerns and a common good. And both of these are global concerns going far beyond sectarian tribal politics and way beyond narrow religion and what they perceive as stale confessional theologies. It was of significance to the Taoiseach that there are 1.8 million young people on this island who have been born since 1998. Their views and actions are fundamental to our shared future. The first of a series of shared island dialogues has already been held. new generations and new voices on the Good Friday Agreement. Young people already rejecting the old binaries, political and religious, will build the future of this island, and they will probably abandon the ideologies into which much of traditional politics and religion are locked. The Belfast Agreement locks us into union or united, while young people pursuing climate justice and a common good for eco-humans may well have a very different vision and future in mind. Shared Island did outline major challenges. They were overcoming the threat of the COVID pandemic, working through the consequences of Brexit, building economic and societal recovery, and tackling the climate and biodiversity crisis. Beyond the old constitutional questions and the old binaries, there are environmental, economic, and cultural issues that make partnerships, cooperation, and collaboration imperative. And however the constitutional question is resolved, or where it goes in the future, there are crucial issues of climate justice, economic regeneration, and health and cultural development that are essential to the flourishing of life together on this island, and if we are to share a common good. In a changing global situation, interdependence and shared energy and imagination are trans-constitutional and ultimate concerns. St. Patrick did not come to a Northern Ireland or to a Republic of Ireland, no matter how sometimes we try to reinvent them in our orange or green images. He returned to the island of Ireland, committed only to the well-being of the people of this island. It turned out to be tough work, but he stuck at it in what can only be described as tenacious solidarity. And tenacious solidarity is neighbourliness, embracing all of the dimensions of life together as an eco-human community of life. There is no flourishing with any form of self-isolation or ourselves alone. And that is not just a challenge to the island of Ireland. It is global, because we share a planet, only one planet, a common home, and the future is shared and cries out for a tenacious solidarity that will overcome the terrible inequalities on this planet. Like Patrick, we commit to all island flourishing, a truly shared island environmentally, economically, educationally, culturally, in diversity, and in health and well-being. The constitutional question is another question, which will not go away, of course, and it may not be resolved by Irish activity. The Union has changed shape some 6 times, and each time in a crisis. It changed in 1801 with the Act of Union, and changed again in 1921 when the Union was reduced by some 25%. And it may reduce or change again with Scottish independence, or even if the growing English nationalism decides itself to leave the Union. In history, there is nothing guaranteed or inevitable. In global terms, it does seem, though, that the future is Asia, and that is going to change the arrangements of political and economic power and our relationships and our worldview. Our cultural world experience and imagination will change, and we will probably have to find ways of living with greater cultural diversity and pluralism. And perhaps there is no way a very traditional unionist or nationalist identity or worldview will survive in the world that is falling apart and at the dawn of a new age. This is why St. Patrick resonates with our time. He lived at a time when an old world was coming to an end. That's what he meant when he spoke of the end of the world. He wasn't some kind of apocalyptic doomsday preacher warning Irish people to flee from the wrath to come. Patrick was not pointing to a chronological end, but to a transformative moment at the edge of history. He was living through the breakup of the Roman Empire, a time of crisis and trauma. A world order was coming to an end. It was the dissolution of a world superpower, the collapse of a domination system. Rome itself was sacked, and the Germanic tribes were on the rampage. The known civilization was collapsing, and many were tempted to despair and were wondering how life could continue. But for Patrick, living through a deep existential crisis, a social and political crisis, there was something more ultimate than the political and economic collapse of a superpower and a world system. Every ending is potentially the birth of newness or the dawn of a new age. Who knows if the USA will survive the great geopolitical shifts in wealth and power, or if the European Union will survive. The United Kingdom is already the disunited kingdom, and there may well be multiple constitutional crises in the next decade or so. We live in trying and uncertain times, and Patrick's letters are letters of hope. We do need shared island dialogues, civic conversations, dialogues with global horizons, and with young people, and their focus on the global environmental issues and vision of a planetary common good. In our shared island and shared planet, conversations and programs of shared action, we still need Patrick's cry for justice, respect for the rights of all humans and the earth, and his call for the abolition of slavery, inequality, and the liberation of women and gender justice. To live through endings is to live into new beginnings and to live into the dawn of a new age. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnston.